Cassidy sat quietly in the car, her hands gripping her purse tightly, her eyes fixed on the outside world as her mind struggled to process the words she had just heard from her husband, Connor. "We're taking my new girlfriend instead of you. She needs a break from her dead-end job," Connor said, his voice cold and detached. His mother, Delilah, sat in the passenger seat, sneering as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Cassidy sat there, completely stunned. The luxury Maldives vacation she had meticulously planned for over a year, now ruined by this casual announcement. It was supposed to be their special getaway, a time to reconnect, but now it was being stolen from her in the cruelest way possible. How could he do this? How could he be so heartless? She had poured so much of herself into this relationship, into making him happy, and now he was casually replacing her. "I can't be hearing this right," Cassidy whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. But the look on Connor's face told her everything. That half-smirk, the one she once found charming, now twisted into something cruel and unfamiliar. At that moment, Delilah, her mother-in-law, adjusted her designer sunglasses and glanced at Cassidy. "Cassidy, darling, surely you saw this coming. Connor needs someone who can keep up with his ambitions." Cassidy felt a cold shiver run down her spine as Delilah's words hit her like a slap. She had always been the one trying to live up to expectations, her mother-in-law's, her husband's, and for what? To be replaced so easily. As the car continued on its way to the airport, Cassidy's world seemed to collapse around her. She had spent months planning this trip, every detail perfect, every moment carefully thought out, and now it was being stolen from her by a woman who had only been in her life for a fraction of the time. This wasn't just a vacation anymore, it was a betrayal. Cassidy's fingers tightened around her purse as she watched the airport grow closer. She hadn't said a word for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. It was like her mind couldn't quite wrap around the reality of it. Her husband, the man she'd spent the past 8 years of her life with, had just dropped a bombshell, an announcement that shattered her whole world. The words echoed in her ears, "We're taking my new girlfriend instead of you." They felt like poison, each syllable slowly seeping into her chest, suffocating her. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. How had she become invisible in her own marriage? She had spent years adapting to Connor's every whim, trying to fit into his world, trying to please him. She had changed her hair for him, her clothes, even her career path. She had become someone else, someone she didn't recognize anymore, just to make him happy. And now, with a flick of his wrist, he was throwing her aside for someone younger, someone more ambitious, someone who fit his mother's ideal of the perfect woman. The car came to a halt at a red light, and Cassidy caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of the window. Her face looked unfamiliar, empty. Was this who she had become? A shadow of herself, shaped by the expectations of others. She'd spent so long trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, that she had forgotten who she was. The woman who once had dreams of her own, of a life beyond Connor's orbit, had disappeared, but not anymore. For the first time in years, Cassidy felt something stir inside her, something new, something fierce. She wasn't going to be the woman who stood by quietly while her life was taken from her. No, she wasn't going to beg him to stay. She wasn't going to cry in front of him or try to convince him that they could fix things. He had made his choice, and she would make hers. Delilah, sitting beside her in the front seat, must have sensed the change in the air. "You know," Delilah said, her voice laced with thinly veiled contempt, "if you just put a little more effort into your career, you might have kept up with Connor. You've been so focused on being a housewife that you've forgotten what really matters." Cassidy blinked, her face flushing with anger. She had spent countless hours with her nose buried in work, supporting Connor's career, helping him with whatever he needed, all while putting her own dreams on the back burner. And now, Delilah had the audacity to call her efforts insufficient. Her thoughts were interrupted by Connor's voice from the front seat. "Cass, why are you so upset? It's just a vacation. We'll go next year, okay?" The dismissiveness in his tone was almost too much to bear. "Next year?" Cassidy repeated, her voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Next year? Is that what you're telling me? After 8 years of marriage? You've been cheating on me, and now you're just going to send me on a pity vacation while you go to the Maldives with your new girlfriend?" Connor turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a scene. I don't have time for this. We're going to the airport. You should have seen this coming. I've been trying to tell you for months." Trying to tell her? She had been the one trying to hold it all together, trying to keep their marriage intact, while he had been slipping away into someone else's arms. The pain inside her chest was suffocating, but it wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that she had allowed herself to become invisible to him, to Delilah, to everyone, but no more. The SUV pulled into the airport parking lot, and Cassidy forced herself to steady her breath. She wasn't going to break down now. She was stronger than this. And for once, she wasn't going to let anyone, especially not Connor or Delilah, dictate her worth. "Cassidy, don't make this harder than it already is," Connor said, his voice softening as if he expected her to fold. "This isn't the end of the world. We're just what?" Cassidy snapped, her eyes flashing with sudden clarity. "You're just replacing me with someone else. Someone who's younger, more ambitious, more like your mother's ideal version of a woman. No, this ends today. I'm done." Delilah made a sound of disdain, her eyes narrowing as if she couldn't believe Cassidy was speaking back to her like this. "You're out of your depth, dear. You think you can keep up with the likes of Connor? You never had a chance." Cassidy's jaw clenched. "I never had a chance." She had fought for this marriage every single day, bending over backwards to meet their expectations, to live up to their standards. And now, after everything, she was being told she didn't have a chance. No more. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to smile. A smile that was both sad and knowing, as if she had finally accepted the truth. She wasn't going to be the woman who cried at the airport. She wasn't going to be the woman who begged for a second chance. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from the travel agent. She had made the call earlier that morning, after finding a text from Tessa, Connor's new girlfriend, about their flight time. Cassidy had already rerouted their luxury Maldives vacation. She had already booked them a place that would shock them to their core. Siberia. The travel agent had confirmed. Their dream vacation to St. Bart's was no more. They were headed to Dixon, Siberia, a remote eco-retreat, a place that was as far from paradise as one could imagine. The irony of it all was too much. Cassidy couldn't help but smile to herself. The SUV came to a stop, and Cassidy looked at her husband and mother-in-law with a newfound strength. "Good luck with your vacation," she said, her voice calm but laced with bitterness. "You'll need it." As she stepped out of the car and grabbed her suitcase, the full weight of her decision hit her. She had been planning this for months, and now she was taking back her power. No more waiting for validation from them, no more bending to their whims. Cassidy was reclaiming her life. Cassidy stood at the curb, watching as the sleek black SUV pulled away, taking Connor and his mother with it. The sound of the engine faded, but the weight in her chest remained, heavier than any suitcase she'd ever carried. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, her suitcase beside her, a silent witness to the unraveling of her life. But when the car was out of sight, something shifted inside her. She looked at her phone. The confirmation email was there, Dixon, Siberia. It was done. Her ex-husband and his new perfect woman would soon find themselves stranded in one of the most remote places on Earth, with nothing but their assumptions and expectations to keep them company. She felt a small spark of satisfaction, but it wasn't about revenge. No, it was about something deeper. It was about freedom. For the first time in years, Cassidy felt like herself again. The woman who had once been vibrant, full of dreams, full of ambition. the woman who had allowed herself to be swallowed up by her husband's career, his family's expectations, and his mother's criticisms. That woman was gone, and standing in her place was someone stronger, someone who refused to settle for less than she deserved. Cassidy took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air fill her lungs. It was time to move on. She flagged down a cab and headed straight to her new apartment. She had already found a place, nothing fancy, but perfect for her. A small, cozy studio in a quiet part of the city, far away from the expensive neighborhood where Connor and Delilah had always wanted to keep her. It was a fresh start, a clean slate. No more pretending to be someone she wasn't. No more being second to a man who couldn't appreciate her. The cab pulled up to the building, and Cassidy paid the driver, stepping out onto the sidewalk. She felt the weight of the moment. This was her new life. No longer would she be the woman who bent over backward to please people who didn't care. No more trying to keep up with Connor's demands. This was her chance to redefine herself, and she was going to do it on her own terms. As she walked into the building, her mind wandered back to her conversation with the travel agent. She had been precise. Every detail had been carefully arranged. The special wilderness retreat, the remote location, the no-cell service policy, it would all hit Connor and Delilah harder than she could imagine. And the best part, it was all legal. Every move she made was within her rights. It wasn't about making them suffer. It was about showing them the consequences of their actions. This was her way of reclaiming the power they had stolen from her over the years. Inside the apartment, Cassidy placed her suitcase down and looked around. It was small, but it felt like the beginning of something new. The walls were bare, but that would change. She would fill this space with things that mattered to her. Things that reflected who she was, not who she was supposed to be. Cassidy walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out a bottle of wine. It wasn't the expensive bottle Delilah would have picked, but it didn't matter. She poured herself a glass and raised it in a silent toast to herself. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she was in control of it now. The phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. It was a text from her sister. "How's the new place? Are you settling in okay?" Cassidy smiled to herself. Her sister had always been her rock, the one person who had never tried to mold her into something she wasn't. Cassidy quickly typed out a reply. "It's perfect. I'm finally free, and I'm going to make the most of it." She hit send, feeling lighter than she had in years. Then, as the phone buzzed again, she glanced at the screen. This time, it was a text from Connor. "You're going to regret this, Cassidy. This isn't over. I'll make sure you pay for this." Cassidy's smile faded slightly, but she didn't let the words sink in. She had no intention of paying for anything. It was Connor who would eventually realize the price of his betrayal. Her phone buzzed again. Another text. "We're stuck in Russia. What the hell is going on? Where the hell are we going?" Cassidy couldn't help it. She chuckled to herself. The panic was already setting in. They had no idea what was waiting for them, but Cassidy wasn't concerned. She was already moving forward, reclaiming her life, one step at a time. She replied with a simple message. "Enjoy Siberia. It's the authentic experience you signed up for." The satisfaction that flooded her was like nothing she had ever felt. This wasn't just about getting back at them, it was about her taking her power back. She set her phone down on the counter and turned her attention back to the apartment. There was a lot to do. She needed to make this place hers. She needed to start her new life, one without Connor, without Delilah, without the toxic expectations that had weighed her down for so long. She had a fresh start now. And nothing, not even the man who had broken her, could take that away from her. The days following Connor's departure passed in a blur of activity, yet Cassidy felt strangely peaceful. Every morning she woke up in her small studio apartment, the sunlight filtering through the windows, casting soft shadows on the walls. It was a new dawn, both literally and figuratively. There was a sense of quiet triumph in her chest, a small, steady hum of satisfaction as she slowly built the life she had always dreamed of. No more pretending, no more living in the shadow of someone else's ambitions. Cassidy found herself waking earlier than usual, not out of necessity, but out of a newfound energy. The hours she had once spent stressing over Connor's needs and trying to please Delilah were now hers to fill with whatever she wanted. She spent her mornings running errands, grabbing coffee at a local cafe, and even picking up a few plants to brighten up the apartment. It was little things like that, the ones she had never allowed herself to enjoy before, that made all the difference. But it wasn't just about filling her days with pleasant distractions. Cassidy knew she needed to rebuild her sense of self. She couldn't afford to lose herself again, not after everything she had been through. The apartment, with its clean lines and fresh start, was her blank canvas. Every choice, every decoration, every moment was hers to decide. One evening, as she sat at her small kitchen table, sipping a glass of wine and reading a book she'd been meaning to finish for months, a thought crossed her mind. She had always been good at planning, at organizing. She'd spent years making Connor's world perfect, but she had never fully committed to building her own. That night, she took out her laptop and opened a new document. It was time to make a plan, one for herself, not for someone else. She listed out everything she wanted to accomplish, reconnecting with her professional network, starting to travel again, pursuing her own career without fear of judgment. The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time in years, Cassidy felt hopeful. The next day, she found herself getting a call from her old colleague, Miguel. It was the same offer he had made months ago, the one she had turned down without a second thought because she knew Connor wouldn't approve. But now, things had changed. Miguel's voice crackled through the phone. "Cassidy, I hope you've been doing well. I know things were complicated with your last job, but we're expanding internationally, and we could really use someone with your expertise. The position is yours if you're still interested." Cassidy sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. This was what she had been waiting for, an opportunity to prove herself, to carve out a space in the world where she didn't have to answer to anyone but herself. She thought for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she prepared her response. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do this." She hung up the phone and took a deep breath. The feeling of empowerment surged through her. This was it, her second chance. Weeks passed, and Cassidy poured herself into her work. The job Miguel offered her was challenging, but it was everything she had ever wanted. She was in charge of planning corporate events and incentive trips for high-profile clients, but this time, she didn't have to hide behind anyone else's success. She was finally doing it for herself. Every day felt like a victory. There was no more second-guessing her decisions, no more worrying about whether Connor or Delilah would approve. Every task she completed, every meeting she attended, reminded her that she was capable, smart, and worthy of success on her own terms. But there was still one thing left, her revenge, the one that would hit harder than any argument or confrontation ever could. The moment she had been patiently waiting for. It had been 3 weeks since she rerouted Connor, Delilah, and Tessa to Siberia, and the photos they had posted on their social media were priceless. Tessa, standing in front of a barren Soviet-era research station, looking horrified. Delilah, clutching her Louis Vuitton bag as if it were a life raft, standing beside a pile of refuse in the middle of a landfill. Connor, his face frozen in disbelief, trying to figure out how to salvage their vacation. Cassidy checked their social media accounts every now and then, watching the fallout unfold. The carefully curated lives they had once showcased were starting to crumble, bit by bit. The facade had cracked, and now the truth was clear, they were out of their depth. And Cassidy, for the first time in years, felt nothing but freedom. The phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Connor's number. Cassidy hesitated before answering. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let him stew in his misery, but there was a part of her that needed closure. She had a right to hear what he had to say. "Cassidy," Connor's voice came through, sounding unusually tense. "This isn't funny. We're stuck in the middle of nowhere. I've had enough of this. I'm coming for you. This isn't over." Cassidy's lips curled into a slight smile. The satisfaction she felt now wasn't from making him suffer. It was from the knowledge that she had finally taken control of her life. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Connor," she replied coolly. "You'll have to figure this one out on your own. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same." There was silence on the other end of the line, then a soft chuckle escaped Cassidy. It wasn't malicious. It was simply the sound of someone who had finally found peace. For the first time in her life, she wasn't playing by anyone else's rules. The call ended abruptly, and Cassidy leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. It wasn't the explosive confrontation she had once imagined. It didn't need to be. What mattered was that she was free, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. The next morning, Cassidy opened her email to find an update from her professional network. An invitation to travel abroad for a high-profile event, a dream opportunity for anyone in her field. But it wasn't just the offer that stood out. It was the realization that she could take this step on her own without needing anyone's approval or permission. As she read through the details, Cassidy's heart swelled with pride. This was her new life, one she had built herself. And as she clicked accept on the opportunity, she knew that this was only the beginning. She wasn't just reclaiming her power. She was redefining what it meant to be herself. Cassidy's days began to follow a rhythm she hadn't known in years, one where she woke up for herself, worked for herself, and lived for herself. She had left behind the woman who had been suffocated by the expectations of others, who had bent herself into someone else's vision of perfection. Now, each day felt like an unfolding adventure, each step forward a declaration that she was reclaiming everything she had lost. The phone calls and emails she received at work were no longer dictated by anyone else's demands. She set the tone. She made the decisions. She organized corporate events that showcased her skills, not to impress anyone, but to prove to herself that she was capable of so much more than she had ever given herself credit for. Her new life was freeing, and yet there was still something inside her, a quiet hunger that had been dormant for far too long. It was the hunger for authenticity, for real connection, for the kind of relationship where she didn't have to shrink herself or compromise her soul. It was a Monday morning when she met him. She had been in a coffee shop, catching up on emails and preparing for the upcoming conference in Europe when a man approached her. He was tall, with dark hair and a kind smile that seemed to immediately put her at ease. He introduced himself as Nathan, a freelance architect who had recently moved to the city. His easy confidence and genuine interest in their conversation made her realize something she hadn't felt in years: curiosity. They talked about architecture, about life in the city, about the little things that made up their worlds. Cassidy found herself laughing easily, sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in ages. And as the conversation continued, something shifted within her. It wasn't just the attraction to Nathan, it was the realization that she hadn't completely lost herself to her past. She was still capable of connecting with someone, still capable of being seen and appreciated for who she was, just as she was. After the coffee shop meeting, Nathan asked if she'd be interested in having dinner sometime. Cassidy hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. There had been so many years of her life where she'd been afraid to take risks, afraid to open up to new possibilities. But that was the old Cassidy, the one who had played small. The new Cassidy, the one who had learned to stand on her own, wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. "Yes," she said, smiling for the first time in a long while. "I'd like that." As weeks passed, Cassidy and Nathan's relationship grew naturally. He wasn't a solution to her pain, nor was he someone to fill the void that Connor had left. But he was a reminder that life, even after betrayal, could still offer genuine connection, real affection, and mutual respect. They spent weekends exploring the city, visiting art galleries, trying new restaurants, and enjoying simple moments together. There was no pressure, no expectations, and that felt like the greatest gift of all. Cassidy's life continued to evolve. She took on more freelance projects, and her name began to spread in the industry. What was once just a small apartment and a fresh start had now blossomed into something bigger, a life built on her own terms. She even began to take the occasional weekend trip, something she had never done before, but now felt fully capable of enjoying without the shadow of her past marriage hanging over her. One day, as she sat at her desk organizing a new project for an international client, she received an email from her lawyer. It was about the divorce proceedings. After a few weeks of back and forth, everything was now final. The house was sold, the assets divided, and the paperwork completed. Cassidy stared at the email for a moment before deleting it. The legalities were done, but what mattered most was that she was done with the past. She had released it all, Connor, Delilah, the toxic expectations, and now there was only forward. Her phone buzzed with a message from Miguel. "How's the project going? I've got a new assignment for you, and I think you'll love it." Cassidy smiled and tapped out a quick response. "I'm ready. Let's do this." But even as her life grew fuller, even as she reclaimed every part of herself, there were moments when the past crept back in. Sometimes she would catch herself in a moment of quiet reflection, and memories of Connor and Delilah would surface. The whispered criticisms, the coldness, the way they had treated her like an afterthought. It would make her angry for a moment. But then, as quickly as the anger came, it would fade. She was no longer that woman, the woman who sought their approval. She had found her worth long ago. One afternoon, as she sat on her balcony sipping a cup of tea, Cassidy checked her phone. There was a message from Connor. "You've made your point, Cassidy, but this isn't over. I'll be seeing you soon. You can't just walk away from this marriage like it meant nothing." Cassidy's smile faded for a moment. She stared at the message, and for a fleeting second, she thought about responding, about telling him how much he had hurt her, about confronting him one last time. But then she remembered. He was no longer her problem. His words didn't hold power over her anymore. She deleted the message and set the phone aside. Life was moving forward, and she was finally free to live it on her own terms. It was around this time that Cassidy received an invitation to a charity gala in New York. The event would feature some of the most prominent names in the business world, clients she had worked with, connections she had made. It was the kind of event where the movers and shakers of the corporate world gathered, and Cassidy had once been too timid to even think about attending. Now, though, she was ready. She was ready to step into the world she had always been part of, but on her own. No longer a shadow, no longer hiding behind someone else's vision of who she should be. The night of the gala, Cassidy stood in front of her mirror, dressed in a sleek black gown, her hair styled to perfection. She took one last look at her reflection, and for the first time in years, she saw herself as she truly was, strong, independent, and beautiful. Tonight, she would shine. The gala was everything Cassidy had imagined and more. The towering glass windows of the venue offered a stunning view of the city skyline, and the elegant decor made everything feel larger than life. Guests mingled with glasses of champagne, discussing business, politics, and art with an air of effortless grace. Cassidy, in her sleek black gown, glided through the crowd, her confidence almost palpable. As she entered the ballroom, she could hear the low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the rustling of expensive fabrics. She had once felt out of place at events like these, always too aware of her position, always second-guessing her place among the high achievers. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was one of them. Nathan was there too, his arm casually around her waist as they made their way toward the open bar. He was everything Cassidy had needed after her divorce: steady, grounded, someone who could see her for who she was, not for who he needed her to be. They exchanged glances, a quiet understanding between them. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They were content in the space they'd carved out together. The evening progressed, and Cassidy found herself reconnecting with old colleagues and forging new professional relationships. She felt the power shift beneath her feet with each interaction. These were the people who had once dismissed her potential, the ones who had overlooked her in favor of more glamorous, more established names. But tonight, Cassidy was no longer invisible. Her presence demanded attention, and she welcomed it. But it wasn't just the success and the connections that made the night so significant. It was the feeling that she was finally living the life she deserved. There was no longer any bitterness from her past, no more need to prove herself to anyone. She had already done the hardest work of all. She had reclaimed her sense of self. It wasn't long before she was pulled into a conversation with a familiar face. She hadn't expected to see him tonight, but there he was, Connor, standing across the room with a glass of wine in his hand, looking as polished as ever. His presence sent a flicker of surprise through her, but it didn't make her heart race the way it once would have. When their eyes met, he gave her that familiar smile, the one he used to reserve just for her, the one that had once made her feel like she was the center of his world. But now, as she studied him, she felt nothing. No longing, no sadness. Just the unmistakable truth: this man no longer had a hold on her. "Cassidy," he said, his voice laced with that confident charm that had once drawn her in. "You look stunning. It's been a while." Cassidy smiled politely, but there was no warmth behind it. "Thank you, Connor. It has been a while." He chuckled, taking a sip from his wine glass. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to see you here tonight. I figured you'd be too busy with the little things." His eyes flickered with what seemed like a challenge, but Cassidy wasn't interested in playing his game anymore. "I've been busy with something much more important," she replied coolly. "Myself." Connor raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. He wasn't used to her speaking to him this way, directly, without the softness and deference he had always gotten from her. But there was a part of him that still expected Cassidy to be the woman he could manipulate, the woman who would chase him, who would want his approval. Cassidy could feel the old familiar temptation to fall back into the role she had once played, the dutiful wife, the woman who had always put him first. But tonight, standing in front of him, she knew exactly who she was. Connor's voice softened, his smirk returning. "So, I guess I should apologize for the way things ended between us. I've been thinking about it a lot lately." Cassidy met his gaze, unfazed. "No need," she said, her voice steady. "You made your choice and I made mine. We're both exactly where we should be." For the briefest moment, Connor's expression faltered, but he quickly recovered, giving her a tight smile. "Well, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Cassidy. You deserve it." His words were empty. Cassidy knew that now. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need his validation. She had everything she needed in this moment: self-respect, clarity, and a future that was finally her own. Later that evening, as the gala continued, Cassidy stepped onto the balcony to get some fresh air. The cool breeze kissed her skin, and she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the peace that had settled over her. For the first time in years, she was at peace with herself. She had shed the layers of her past, the self-doubt, the anger, the feeling of being overlooked. She was no longer the woman who lived in the shadows of someone else's life. She was the woman who had taken back everything that had been hers to begin with. As Cassidy stood there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Nathan. "Are you okay? "You've been awfully quiet tonight." She smiled at the screen, her fingers quickly typing a response. "I'm more than okay. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Cassidy leaned back against the railing, watching the city lights twinkle below. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up. And now, for the first time in a long time, the world felt wide open, full of possibilities. She had freed herself. From the betrayal, from the hurt, from the manipulation. And what remained now was a woman who was unapologetically herself. The weeks after the gala blurred into a continuous wave of achievements and personal milestones. Cassidy's work continued to thrive, and with each successful event she managed, her confidence grew. She was no longer the woman who had spent every waking moment trying to please others. She was now the woman who made choices for herself, guided by her own desires and dreams. Nathan, too, had become an integral part of her life, though not in the way she had once imagined a relationship might be. They weren't rushing, nor were they trying to force anything. They simply enjoyed each other's company, savoring the quiet moments and small adventures that filled their days. Cassidy had no need to define her relationship with Nathan. It was real and authentic, and that was enough. He saw her for who she truly was, no pretenses, no expectations, just the woman she had become. But as time passed, Cassidy knew there was one final part of her healing that she had yet to confront: the past, the betrayal, and the woman she had been before. It had been a journey of rediscovery, but it was time to finally let go completely. It was time to stop measuring her worth based on her relationship with Connor, Delilah, or anyone else. One afternoon, as Cassidy sat at her desk, a familiar name popped up in her inbox. It was a message from her lawyer, updating her on the final divorce settlement. It had taken months of legal back and forth, but now everything was finalized. The property had been divided, and she was no longer tied to the life she had once shared with Connor. It felt like the final chapter had been written, and the book could be closed. Cassidy stared at the email for a few moments, allowing herself to feel the weight of it. It wasn't anger or resentment that filled her now, but a deep sense of liberation. This part of her life was over, and she had survived it. She could feel the release in her chest, a deep sigh of relief. The years of trying to keep up, the false hopes of reconciliation, the constant cycle of disappointment, those were no longer hers to carry. Without hesitation, Cassidy deleted the email. She didn't need to dwell on the past anymore. It was done. It was over. That evening, Cassidy walked to the balcony of her apartment and gazed out at the city. The skyline stretched endlessly before her, the lights twinkling like stars in the vast expanse of the night. She had done it. She had walked through the darkness, and now she stood on the other side, stronger, clearer, and finally free. For the first time in years, there was nothing holding her back. Not the memories of Connor's betrayal, not the judgment of Delilah, not the expectation to conform to anyone else's standards. Cassidy was free to live her life in whatever way she chose, without apology, without regret. She picked up her phone and checked her messages. There were updates from work, a few texts from Nathan asking if she wanted to join him for dinner, and even a message from her sister, excited about a new project Cassidy was taking on. But as her eyes scanned the screen, her gaze stopped on something unexpected, a notification from Instagram. It was a photo posted by none other than Connor, showing him and Delilah at a lavish resort. In the caption, he had written, "Starting fresh. Sometimes the best way forward is to leave the past behind." Cassidy smiled, but it wasn't with bitterness. She felt no jealousy, no anger. The life they were trying to portray for their followers wasn't real, and she knew it. The truth was that they were both just as lost as they had been when they were in her life. The smiles they wore couldn't hide the cracks beneath. She closed the app, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The next day, Cassidy packed a small bag and boarded a plane to Paris. It had always been a dream of hers to visit the city, to walk the cobblestone streets and explore the art and culture she had always admired from afar. She wasn't running away from anything, she was moving toward something. Toward a future filled with new experiences, new opportunities, and the freedom to write her own story. As the plane ascended into the sky, Cassidy looked out the window, the city shrinking below her. She had come so far, and there was still so much more to do. The future was open, limitless, and it was all hers. When the plane touched down in Paris, Cassidy stood up, gathering her things, feeling the thrill of the unknown bubbling inside her. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about the fact that she had taken control of her life. She had chosen herself. And as she stepped off the plane, Cassidy felt a deep, unwavering certainty. She was finally free. Free from the chains of her past, free from the expectations of others. Her life was hers to shape, to create, to live. For the first time in years, Cassidy was exactly where she needed to be, and the journey had only just begun.